Okay, cool. So I'm just gonna hit record just to make sure I don't miss
Sure.
anything.
I can share this with you after too.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Just to make sure there. Okay, yeah. So once again, Mr. O'Toole, thank you for sitting down with us. We really appreciate it here at Canadian Manufacturing. So, of course, Biden's infrastructure bill has been huge in the news this year, and Canadian manufacturers are concerned about job losses and a labor shortage that's being exacerbated by the supply chain and COVID, and now the infrastructure bill. So, I did want to start off by asking you what you think that our federal government should currently be doing to fight the tax credit being introduced. I think they said it was like $12.5 grand US for the purchase of electric vehicles if they're manufactured in the US. So just wanted to get your thoughts on what Trudeau and the federal government should be doing, especially this week. I think they're having that Three Amigos summit, so just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I'm deeply concerned. Canada-U.S. relations have never been at such a low point in my life. And, I grew up, my dad worked at General Motors in Oshawa. So the Auto Pact and that integrated North American economy has been something we've kind of relied on for our economic prosperity. And in the last few years, actually going back to the Obama administration, Trump, and now Biden, more Buy American, more unfair tariffs, renegotiation of NAFTA to our detriment. There's no shared strategy on China with respect to trade. And we're losing that special relationship that traditionally we had with the United States. I've been pushing Trudeau and Freeland to be much more serious and integrate trade and security discussions to allow Canada to have a special position again. So the subsidy for electric vehicles only manufactured in the U.S., that violates trade law, and it violates the spirit of the Auto Pact that we've had since the 1960s. So we need a reset in Canada-U.S. relations.
Interesting, yeah. And I hope that messaging comes out strong when our federal government meets with the U.S. Of course, because of the pandemic, we've also noticed a number of automotive plants in Ontario and across Canada have announced a reduction in production or cut shifts and things like that. I know Stellantis was one of them that announced a cutting at their shift at their plant in Windsor. From a domestic perspective, I'm wondering what our federal government could or should be doing to sort of allay some of the cuts happening here.
Yeah, I spoke to Stellantis today, actually, alongside some other manufacturers here in Ontario. The supply chain shortage, the semiconductor chip shortage we're seeing is causing ripple effects, and unfortunately, some of the vehicles we're manufacturing here aren't as high value, and so what limited supply of semiconductors there are going to the U.S. first or another market. So we should be integrating our supply chain resilience alongside American efforts, and we're nowhere to be seen. The UK, the US, a lot of our allies, but also our competitors, are having serious supply chain resilience programs. That's why I announced my shadow cabinet this week. We have not only our shadow minister for international trade, but for supply chain resilience. We should be integrating that with the United States. So I would like to see Prime Minister Trudeau finally stand up and make the case for Canada with President Biden. State dinners, tweets, the nice words in an election get us zero. And in fact, we're falling further and further behind. And our manufacturers here have the added burden of high energy costs, carbon tax, a whole range of things that the US markets aren't doing. And our pace of development, the approval for a program, the approval for a support program from government is slow. It's a glacial pace. The global competition right now for EVs and everything else is ferocious, and Canada is too timid under Mr. Trudeau.
So with that in mind, sort of tied to this, there's an ongoing labor shortage plaguing the manufacturing industry. A lot of manufacturers are turning to automation solutions or technology to sort of solve these problems. The federal government announced a renewed focus on clean tech innovation and pushing the electrification of certain industries. Accelerate, I think, is one of the is a supply chain alliance for zero emission vehicles. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on our federal government sort of pushing the electrification of the automotive manufacturing industry or clean tech industries in general?
Well, we put forward a very smart plan to reduce our emissions, to prepare and actually build out some of the infrastructure we're going to need for more adoption of EVs. In fact, I heard someone in industry use the term range hesitancy. You know, people are worried about are they going to have the infrastructure here? That's where the government has the role. And right now we see the Trudeau government setting an agenda that's actually just not achievable unless they subsidize the acquisition of vehicles at a ferocious rate. What we should do is make sure Canada maintains its competitive advantage as a manufacturer, one of the best in the world. We just have to be competitive. The role of government is to build out the infrastructure for more EVs on the road, rather than 2 or 3% of vehicles being purchased being EVs. If it went up to 10, we wouldn't have the infrastructure ready right now. And how can we do those things without getting into this bidding war to pay rich people money to buy an EV they may buy anyway? It's unfair. It's helping people that are already well off. What we need to do is have a reasonable transition to more and more EVs that allows us to make them here, have fair trade rules with the United States, and I would like to see an Auto Pact 2.0 for the EV revolution, and have Canada show global leadership on rare earth minerals and battery production. We have the materials, we have the supply, we have the capabilities to process. We should allow the Americans to rely on us as that supplier and supplier for energy. The fact that the Biden administration's asking OPEC to increase oil supply when they canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, we should be the supplier of rare earth minerals, of energy, of forestry products to our friend and ally on a preferred basis.
And I'm really glad you brought up the natural resources strengths that Canada has, obviously with rare earths and battery production and things like that. So sort of links to sort of my next question was I'm wondering if there are certain areas Canada can apply these sort of trade pressure when it comes to Buy America. I know I recently read that Biden is a little bit miffed about our trade deals when it comes to softwood lumber, dairy imports, and things like that. So I'm wondering if there are certain areas, whether it's rare earths or battery materials and things like that, where Canada can apply some of this pressure to sort of negate that $12,500 tax and things like that.
That's a great question, and here's where Mr. Trudeau has completely dropped the ball. Historically, Canada and the US are friends, family in some cases, neighbors and allies. Since World War II, we've had NORAD, the North American Security Relationship, with Canada's Arctic, with our joint forces. We have the longest undefended border. We have free trade agreements going back to the Auto Pact of the 1960s. This is all pre-Mexico. It's also pre-rise of China as a manufacturer. 3 years ago, I said to Minister Freeland, let's leverage our security partnership, our ability to have strategic commodity sharing like rare earths. Let's join ballistic missile defense to work with the Americans in the Arctic at a time that Russia and China have Arctic ambitions. We need to make sure that the US knows their only partner in the entire world on homeland security, on trade, on supply chain resilience is Canada. And our energy supplies, our resources, should give us a preferred access point to see a Canada-US manufacturing zone. The Great Lakes Basin is the historic home of the auto industry. Not just Flint, Michigan, my community of Oshawa, Ontario, Windsor, Oakville, St. Catharines. We have the ability in that Great Lakes Basin to compete with the world, but we have to stand up in a joint way to the unfair trade practices of China. We have to stand up and have our own supply of critical resources, and we should see EV leadership, but we have to make sure the Americans view us as an equal and as a peer. Mr. Trudeau, what's he been talking about in those 3 years? The progressive trade agenda, pushing issues that aren't even critical to a trade deal. That's why Mexico got a deal before Canada did. We've always been 2 steps behind with the Trudeau government. With me, someone who worked for a manufacturer in the private sector, I was counsel to Procter & Gamble with manufacturing facilities in Ontario. I get this, and I'm going to fight for our access.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad to hear all that. Yeah, so, and that sort of leads to my next question about sort of connecting our supply chain resiliency with the US. And I'm wondering if things continue as is, and if things don't really change, and there isn't a lot of pressure applied from our federal government on the Biden government, is there concern that the tax credit for US made cars might grow into other types of tax credits, or that the supply chain disruptions might grow worse, or that other industries might start to get affected beyond the automotive sector and things like that?
That is a fear. As I said at the outset of this interview, Canada-US relations under Mr. Trudeau are at their worst ever. And they can't blame the Trump administration anymore. On his first day, Biden canceled Keystone XL, a pipeline critical to North American energy independence. Now President Biden's begging Saudi Arabia to produce more oil. But it's not just that. Over the last few years, steel, aluminum, dairy, softwood lumber tariffs have doubled. And now we see an up to $15,000 subsidy for only a made-in-US EV, direct violation of trade deals with us that they just signed, and they've signed going back to the 1960s. So we have to stand up for our interests, remind the Americans of the shared prosperity that came from the Auto Pact, from Canada-US free trade, from NAFTA. We should be working with them to counterbalance China's bad trade practices. So right now, Mr. Trudeau has made us irrelevant on the world stage. Even our closest allies, the US and Australia and the UK, are having new agreements without Canada. We used to be one of the Five Eyes countries. So we've got to assert our national interests better. We've got to also make sure the Americans realize their national interests and ours are joined. And so this is where I think I'm well suited to fix things. Whenever we can replace this government. I served in the military. I've served alongside the Americans at times. I've worked in the private sector, including with an American manufacturer here in Canada. We have to get back to that preferred relationship that I see just being frittered away.
No, absolutely. And I see you making a lot of strong points about how closely joined our interests are with the U.S. Interests as well when it comes to the infrastructure and just basically building a counter to China's strengths when it comes to the supply chain. So with that in mind, I'm curious if there are certain burgeoning sectors that you think that Canadian manufacturing or the federal government should be focusing on, or should be really supporting when it comes to trade talks with Biden. Like, how much more can we really push battery materials and natural resources and things like that? Are there certain things that our federal government should be leveraging that they haven't really been?
Yeah, supply chain resilience. With the U.S. worried about disruptions in Asia or elsewhere slowing down their productivity and their manufacturing, they should be able to rely on us. Energy independence, Canada-U.S., they should be able to rely on us. That's why pipeline, that's why transmission. Line 5 is a risk. Mr. Trudeau's done nothing. Maine just refused a transmission line from Quebec for hydroelectric power.
Yeah.
Climate change, not only hydro, not only interties with the US, nuclear as well. Any serious country, if you're going to have a long-term, low-carbon future and have an industrialized economy, nuclear has to be part of the equation. We are the best in the world at that innovation too, and we haven't sold it well enough. Mr. Trudeau's own cabinet doesn't even agree that nuclear needs to be part of the energy mix for climate change. We do. In the election, we were willing to put $1 billion right up front to maintain that leadership. I represent Durham with the Darlington Generating Station. Ontario's competitive advantage is our GHG emission-free power, up to about more than half, about 60% of our energy supply between hydro and nuclear. So we have to get competitive on some of these strategic things, from supply chain resilience, traditional energy, and low-emission energy.
For sure. Absolutely. I'm glad to hear all of that. Finally, I just wanted to ask you, I know Parliament resumes soon. I'm wondering what the main focus of your party is going to be, I guess, moving into 2022, and when it comes to pressuring Trudeau. What do you really want to see happen next year?
I'm really worried about our economy, and most Canadians are as well. Inflation is over 4%, the highest rate in 20 years. We're going to see a risk of interest rate increases. We see a bad trade relationship with the United States, which is almost half of our GDP is in that trade relationship, is directly tied up in that. The spending and increasing taxes is making us less competitive. And I'll tell you, if interest rates continue to go up because of inflation, if spending continues to go up, Mr. Trudeau is setting us up for a debt crisis in a few years. So I think part of the solution is making us more competitive, so we see private sector capital investment. I'd like to see a manufacturing renaissance, and that's why the U.S. relationship is so key. So that would be my number one priority. Line 5, the doubling of softwood, the dairy tariffs, this electric vehicle trade action now from the Biden administration, more and more buy American at all levels of U.S. government. We really need to reconnect with our friend and allies, and we need to do that by reminding them Canada stood alongside them. We fought and died alongside one another. I'm wearing my poppy now. I went to Washington as minister and spoke in the Capitol building because of the first Special Service Force in World War II, where Canadians and Americans fought together in what was called the Devil's Brigade. And we have to reignite that special relationship that has allowed both of our countries to not only become prosperous world leaders, it's helped with our security.
Absolutely. No, I'm really glad to hear all that. Mr. O'Toole, this was a real privilege to be able to sit down with you. I really appreciate you guys coming in on short notice and scheduling this. So I'll most likely develop this into a Q&A to publish on our site and push out and everything like that. I think my only last request is if I could get a photo of you maybe.
Yeah, by your